Hello, and a very good morning, good afternoon, and even a very good evening to all of you joining us from all over the world. This is the World Association of Girl Guides and Girl Scouts 16 Days of Activism panel discussion. And today we are going to focus on gender-based violence and victim blaming. To talk about these topics, we are joined by a beautiful panel of ladies from all over the world. And let me start off by introducing them. Our first panelist is Aliza Alexander, who is 31 years old and is joining us from Malaysia. Aliza Alexander is a primary school teacher by profession, teaching English and mathematics to young learners. She has been awarded the Excellent Teacher Award for Extra Curriculum, as well as the Microsoft Innovative Educator Expert Award. She plays the role as the District Brownies Commissioner, coordinating events for young girls and assisting leaders to manage their units. Apart from this, she has been an active young leader of the Girl Guides Association in Malaysia. She believes that education and empowerment will make an impact on girls' lives as she strives to uphold this through her engagement with the community. Good evening, Aliza.
Good evening.
Our second panelist is Florencia Diaz, is a 27-year-old leader from the Argentinian Association of Girl Guides and the sub-coordinator in her Girl Guide community. She is also part of the Juntas Transformanos Guide community, or the Together We Transform, an advocacy project that emerged as an initiative of the World Association of Girl Guides and Girl Scouts in alliance with the Avon Foundation. She is also a mother of a 6-year-old supergirl and has a degree in surgical instrumentation. She was at the top of her class and was awarded for having the best average upon graduation. Good evening, Flo.
Good evening.
Our third panelist is Sia. Sia Granali is 18 years and is joining us all the way from Philippines and is a grade 12 student under the Science, Technology and Engineering and Mathematics strand, most commonly known as the STEM system. She is an active member of the Girl Scouts of the Philippines and has represented the movement in international events. Lastly, Sia Rather is passionate about championing for girls and women's rights, women empowerment, and gender equality. Good evening, Sia.
Good evening.
All right. Our next panelist is Dasuni. That would be me. I am also your moderator today. I am representing the Sri Lanka Girl Guides Association, and I'm also the national coordinator for the Stop the Violence movement here in Sri Lanka, where we hold a lot of workshops for the awareness on gender stereotypes and gender-based violence across all 9 provinces in Sri Lanka. Additionally, I am also a journalist and a news anchor for a leading media organization in Sri Lanka. Our next panelist is Yvette. Yvette is 22 years old and is joining us from Rwanda. She's a member of the Rwanda Girl Guides Association and works with AGR in the Action on Body Confidence program and a communication team member. She is also a mentor on Speak Up projects. Apologies for that. She's also a member of the Speak Out project and implements on actions for Rwanda aiming of gender-based violence prevention. On her panel, she wants to share on rehabilitation for gender-based violence for victims of Rwanda. Good evening, Yvette.
Good evening.
All right, we are also joined by Sophie Nelson. Sophie Nelson is a youth advocate with the World Association of Girl Guides and Girl Scouts based in Northern Ireland and studying history and politics at the University of Manchester. Sophie is a Girl Guide leader and the UK Girl Guide advocate spokesperson and blogger. She also speaks on multiple issues related to girls' needs and rights and has represented girl guiding in the British Youth Council. A body confidence activist, Sophie is regularly involved in campaigning against the depiction of females in the media and has delivered several speeches in Northern Ireland as part of the No More Page 3 campaign. Good evening, Sophie.
Good evening.
Last but not least, we are also joined by our interpreter this evening, that is Kat Campbell, who is joining us all the way from Canada and will be here to assist you throughout this meeting. So starting off, our topic today is gender-based violence and victim blaming. Now, these are 2 words that we often hear year in and year out. But what exactly is victim blaming and the manifestation of victim blaming? And this question I would like to pose firstly to Sophie. Sophie?
Thanks, Dasini, for that. So victim blaming occurs when a victim of a crime, which when we talk about victim, we can assume that that is the person on which the crime is being committed onto. And they are held either entirely or partially responsible for that crime. And so victim blaming has manifested itself in a number of ways, especially in the UK. We can look at how victims of violence against women, specifically looking at sexual assault, women have become blamed as a subject of this sexual assault being their fault. And so 20% of women have experienced some kind of sexual assault since the age of 16 in the UK. And yet only around 15% of those who have experienced that report it to the police. And so there's a real issue with the amount of victims of sexual assault and those who are actually reporting it. And I think that comes down to the fact that we have stopped treating it as a crime, and we have started to question the sanity of women who are experiencing this crime. And so we turn it on the victim and not and find it easier to blame the victim rather than the perpetrator of the crime. So I think a good way of kind of putting it is that, say, for example, there is a burglary that goes on down the street from you, and someone's house has been burgled, and you hear about the burglary. It happened when the person who was living in the house went out to the shop, and they came back and it was in broad daylight and someone had burgled their home. And so when I think of that event, I think, oh no, that's an awful crime. But I also think, oh, the person who was burgled must have, say, left the door on a latch, or they perhaps left the house at an inconvenient time. And that wouldn't happen to me necessarily. I would have made sure that the door was locked properly, or I would have chosen a different time to leave the house. And so even if we're not intentionally blaming the victim, we find that in our subconscious, we are trained to question the victim of the crime. And so we see that manifest itself within victims of sexual assault, and also more widely in the UK more recently. We have seen it against women in the media, and how women are portrayed as victims, often women who are politicians or in positions of power. For example, Tracy Brabin, who was a Labour MP in the UK, was slaughtered on social media earlier this year for wearing an off-the-shoulder dress, and she was called names and victimized as a result of this. And so we really, I think, find it easier to blame the perpetrator or the victim rather than question the kind of structures that uphold it. So victim blaming, I hope you got kind of more of a sense of the fact that it's programmed into our subconscious, and victims aren't always or are usually not at fault.
Right. Thank you for that introduction, Sophie. Also, my question is to Sia. How do you see victims being blamed in your country? Could you maybe give us a perspective of victim blaming in your country?
Thanks, Dasini. So now that we know what victim blaming is, most of us may already have an idea of how victim blaming look in our own countries. And in the Philippines, one of the most common forms of victim blaming is about what the victim was wearing at the time of harassment or assault, and or if the girl was the one to approach the guy or the perpetrator first. And even maybe even in other countries, it's the same thing. And questions and sentiments like, what were you wearing? Was your skirt too short? If you don't wear something revealing, it could have not happened, or you should cover yourself the next time, or she approached me first, are the ones that we often hear or get. And these are manifestations of victim blaming, because these questions and sentiments are actually blaming the victim for what had happened to her. Now, these questions are terrifying. First of all, what we wear is not consent. We don't dress to get harassed. We don't dress for boys or for men. We are not asking for it. Tribes in the Philippines, if we look at it, are actually topless at times or reveals a little bit part of their skin, but they don't get raped or get harassed because it's their tradition. And so when we look at it at a different perspective, infants and children aged 4 to 6 years old are also victims of gender-based violence. And we can say that it is because of their clothes that they get harassed. We also experience or witness victim blaming when we go to school or work, where we even dress appropriately and we still get harassed. But then our skirt's length get questioned. Was it too short? Was it too much of a skin that was revealed or shown? Now, with this, we can really say that the issue of victim blaming is not all about what the person was wearing. What's in it? What's in clothes that give boys and men the right to harass or assault us? And what's in what we wear that it becomes a basis for respect? We all deserve to be respected regardless of what we wear. Just because a girl wore a skirt or approached a guy doesn't mean that the guy could take advantage of the girl. Not at all. And the second manifestation would be that people often ask, why didn't you scream? So it's all about the silence of the victim. It's because you didn't do anything, maybe you liked it. Or why didn't you leave? Why did you just speak now? And these sentiments are frustrating. Just because a victim stayed silent doesn't mean she liked it. She stayed silent because she was terrified, traumatized, and helpless when it happened, not because she liked it. And it takes a lot of courage to speak out. Because of this prevailing act wherein the victims get blamed for what had happened to her, can we really expect her to speak out at once? Do we really think that it's easy for victims to open up to authorities or persons close to them when the perpetrators are the authorities or the persons close to them themselves? So victim blaming doesn't just happen in physical interactions. In social media, victim blaming is evident. Some girls and women post photos and videos of themselves and get malicious comments from people. And some even justify it by saying that her clothes speak as if it's asking for it, or she should change her clothes. So why is it the victim's fault now? She is not asking for it. To end, I would like to take this time to repeat that what she wears is not consent. Silence is not consent. Her being drunk is not a consent. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Sia. Also, Yvette, would you mind sort of telling us the situation in your country in terms of victim blaming and what the situation is like?
Yes, thank you very much. I'm going to use some common terms that I want to mention here. And that one is a victim and a perpetrator. So when we say, in case of gender-based violence, when we say someone is a victim, that means when gender-based violence was happening, she was the one who experienced it. I mean, she was the one, it was done towards her or him. And a perpetrator is the person who just commit. So actually, victim blaming is not something we should be happy of. And that's why we are here talking about it and calling up all Girl Scouts and Girl Guides around to take the lead toward this elimination. Why? Imagine a victim has fallen into gender-based violence, and instead of probably blaming the perpetrator, now the victim is the one being blamed. I mean, she's getting responsible of what the perpetrator did. So it's a very bad story that we are calling upon everyone around to work towards this, because if a gender-based violence is committed, either physical, be emotional, be economic, be sexual, that you're emphasizing today, as also in these 16 days of activism, it's not a good approach when the victim herself is being blamed instead of being helped. So actually, the situation in my country, it has different manifestations that you also must have a common understanding on this and make sure that there is a change which must be immediate. So, for example, we might have girls and boys living apart, and when you go and visit the guy, he said, I haven't taken him.
Yvette, just a minor interruption. Would you mind turning on your camera for us so everybody can see who you are this evening?
Okay, yeah. So thank you
Hello.
very much.
No problem.
Yes, I think I can continue from where I am. So I was just saying that as Girl Guides and Girl Scouts around, you must speak towards this, because when a victim is the one who has committed a mistake and then he's the one being blamed, it's a very big problem. Instead, she might be helped and the perpetrator be taken into account for either to change, not to strengthen or to lengthen the GBV commitment within his society. So actually, I was giving the scenario to my country, Rwanda. It is manifested in different ways. I was saying probably you go and visit a boy and she said, she just came into my house, what was she expecting, while you had your own decisions, but she kept interrupting you to just come. I can also say some facts that a GBV is reported and a perpetrator may say, you're lying, it hasn't happened. And this goes with probably the loss of facts, the tangible facts, which may be physical. Because we say that violence is when something is done towards you without your consent. Now, imagine you don't have something to prove that wasn't really your consent. It becomes a problem. So the other manifestation, this gender-based violence doesn't only stop in not married people. Even married people experience the gender-based violence. You may find someone married and then she has been experiencing this gender-based violence from his intimate partner. As a medical student, I admit such cases in the hospital. I mean, a woman who has been probably beaten physically or did any sexual harassment by his husband, who is literally his intimate partner. So this is a quite bad thing, but people may say, because she's married, she cannot experience that it was not by force, it was not violence, There is also another scenario. Or as my colleague here was saying, the clothes, the appearance. Someone thinking that the way you dress is probably attracting him, while that is what makes you happy, We rotate through this intuition of body confidence, like you did something which fits you, and someone is trying to observe it in another different context. So there is really another bad thing that you might work to. So I may also share this social media thing, because it also play a big part, a big role towards this. Or its manifestation probably at work or any time. So in Rwanda, at least 22% of women have experienced gender-based violence in 2019 upon the recent report, and 5% were men. So the gender-based violence manifestation and victim blaming is not limited to only women. Even men are affected, but you see the difference in the percentage, like 22 for women and 5% for men. This means women are mostly affected. And that is why a call to action now comes, because you can't truly stay over this as responsible citizens. So we're calling upon all the decision makers to make sure that in case of gender-based violence, the victim must be helped instead to be blamed of what she did, because this is something which has already happened. Now let us intervene to probably prevent the effects which might come over it, instead of blaming him, and because blaming him even let the perpetrator continue doing what she was doing. But when the victim is helped and the perpetrator is taken into account probably by laws according to which govern the country, this is why now they stand and make sure that they're not committing it again. We're stopping the outcome. We are stopping the lengthening of this gender-based violence. So this is a call to action to every Girl Guide and Girl Scout following this. Let us not blame the GBV victims. Instead, let us expose the perpetrators to stop the lengthening. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yvette. My next question is actually to Aliza. Aliza, we often find that girls and young women are often blamed for when they experience violence. This is something quite common. Why do you think that it's always the girl who faced such an unfortunate incident that is often blamed for what she had to go through?
Thank you, Dasuni, for the question. I would like to start with a scenario. So, in 2018 in the UK, women were asked to avoid using their handphones in the street, meaning they will not be able to talk, they will not be able to text, and they couldn't even listen to music in the street because a serial rapist has been targeting such women. So women had to protect themselves from being raped. And if they happen to be raped, then it's their fault. Why? Why are women and girls often blamed for being a victim? So, from my point of view, and through thorough research and from my observation, I came down to this one word called sexism. And sexism means prejudice or discrimination based on a particular gender. And on this topic of sexism, I'm going to touch on two different aspects. Firstly, is societal norms and culture. So let's look at a particular culture, which is the patrilineal culture, which mostly dominates in underdeveloped nations or developing nations. Victims are usually stigmatized in this particular culture, where male supremacy is at height, and women are usually subordinates and they are usually labeled as the weaklings. And in such culture, in such patrilineal culture, there are strong customs and taboos regarding sex and sexuality, meaning sex is a forbidden word. It's a bad word to say, and it's not something that you can discuss openly with your parents, with your friends, or even in school. And in such culture, victims of gender-based violence, whether it's a girl or a boy, they are usually labeled as someone who is damaged. And the consequences of that is that they usually go into isolation. And if the person is married, they could even be divorced. And this could also lead to suicidal cases. Let's look at developed nations. Developed nations are also inclusive of such societal norms where misogyny remains culturally ingrained. And looking at this kind of aspect where most policymakers or lawmakers comprises of men, though we are striving for gender equality, the gender gap is still there. And men usually would empathize for men. And in this case, no matter if they are the victim or if they are the perpetrator, they are usually supported in this case. And lawmakers and policymakers usually feel sorry for them. And this is actually has been backed up by various research by various institutes. And having that, law and policies are usually unfavorable to men. And this has also been supported by a concept called just world hypothesis, whereby people usually believe that people deserve what happens to them. So when a girl is raped, when a girl is sexually assaulted, it's usually on them because the perpetrators usually would automatically have this defense mechanism to blame someone. And this is not something that's new or external. It's actually biological and psychological to all human beings. It just depends on how we accept it. But it's ingrained in our culture, it's ingrained in our society. And this is why women are usually blamed when they experience violence. So that's the first one, that's society norms and culture. Now let's look at the second part, which was shared by Cher just now, the myth of women, the myth of gender violence. Women these days are more modern and independent. And having that, the consequences of it is that we are being labeled with this myth that sexy clothing and high risk lifestyle, these two myths that contributes to violence. So as shared earlier, sexy clothing, meaning they are stimulating sexual aggression in men. So it's the fault of the woman because men do not wear any sexy clothing, I guess. So women are not stimulated. But in this sense, the myth is that men are stimulated because women are wearing sexy clothes. And secondly, high risk lifestyle. These days, women, they drink alcohol, they party late night. So that contributes to the myth that they are available to be sexually harassed and to face gender based violence. And I wonder how an infant or an 89-year-old grandmother could actually put herself in a position of wearing sexy clothes and being raped or sexually assaulted. So that's a big question for us to think about, and I'll pass it on to Dasuni. Thank you.
Thank you for that insight, Eliza. Also, Sophie, why do you think this might be in your perspective?
Thanks, Jasini and Eliza, you covered that so well. I'll just kind of bring my perspective. I think overall, it's so much easier for us to take down or blame an individual rather than address the kind of structural problems that lie behind that. And in doing so, we shift the focus from the fault of the perpetrator to the fault of the victim, simply because we can kind of it's so much easier to do, and it means that we don't have to address the wider issue, and the wider issue is such a big issue to tackle because it's essentially addressing the patriarchy. And when I talk about patriarchy, I'm speaking about male dominance in society. So, and Eliza raised this before, but in our institutions, in our courts of law, in our law enforcement, we see the field dominated by men. So taking the UK as an example, the UK Supreme Court sees only 1 woman to 10 men. And so if that's the representation of the court of law, how does that is going to have some impact on filtering down into society. And so if the representation isn't there at the highest levels, then how can we represent those victims to the best of our ability? And so victims often fall short of getting the justice that they deserve. I also think it's written kind of, and I've spoke a bit about this before, but it's written into our subconscious that we think, oh, that wouldn't happen to me, or I wouldn't find myself in that situation, so I wouldn't have had as many drinks that night. I wouldn't have worn that dress. And again, here we are putting the focus on the victim and not focusing on the wider problem. And if we continue to do that, and if we continue to focus on the individual, then we will see fewer and fewer cases reported, because we're blaming and we're questioning and we're looking into that traumatic event that has happened, and people will question themselves then, oh, well, maybe I did drink too much, or I was wearing revealing clothing, and therefore, oh, maybe it was my fault, and I'll just leave it, because going into it and unpacking that further would be too complex and complicated, and it's easier if I just don't come forward. And so we find it less stressful and less invasive if we just set that to the side. So I think that women are blamed because it's easier for people to do so. I think that it's also a reflection of patriarchy in our wider institutions. And also because we, as many of us as citizens, uphold that value through reproducing these claims in our mind that, oh, that wouldn't have happened to me, or maybe it was her fault. So there's a number of reasons that we need to address here.
Thank you for that, Sophie. Yes, next question is for Flo, who's joining us all the way from Argentina. Flo, how has this lockdown, which was induced purely because of COVID-19 in Argentina, sort of impacted the girls and young women who experience violence in Argentina? If you could maybe tell us what the situation is like in Argentina.
Well, in Argentina, the quarantine began on March 20th, 2020. Last November 20th, the Gender Violence Observatory called Now the Disease published that after 245 days of isolation, 184 femicides of women and girls were registered. Adding to this, the 84 femicides that were committed from January 1st to the beginning of isolation. We have relevant data. 265 femicides were committed between January 1st and November 20th, 2020. Following these statistics, we will end today, listen this number please, with 280 femicides. 3 of them were trans femicides, 9 were girls, 64% of murders were partners or former partners, 65% were killed in their homes. 61 victims had made a formal complaint or had judicial protection measures. At least 230 children lost their mothers as a result of sexist, chauvinistic violence in 2020. So 1 femicide every 29 hours. Looking at this data, we can say that women's homes continue to be the most unsafe space. The violence increased in the context of social, preventive, and compulsory isolation, where the victims were exposed with their aggressor. As a result, 74% of femicides occurred within the home, while femicide on public roads decreased compared to 2019. This decrease isn't due to the fact that they don't violate us in the street, but rather to the fact due to compulsory isolation. This sexist violence was restricted during the pandemic. We also observed that every 18 days, a girl under the age of 15 is murdered, and also an adult over the age of 60, which confirmed that sexist violence is a structural problem that affects all women in an international way, regardless of our diversities or socioeconomic background. We are all in danger, even with the Women Integral Protection Law to prevent, punish, and eradicate violence against women and other judicial protection measures, and to avoid victimization, which reveals the ineffectiveness of the judicial system in the face of cases of violence against women. Finally, during the pandemic, the use of line 124 and a WhatsApp number that provide 24 hours assistance to victims was reinforced. And hard work from the Ministry of Women, Gender, and Diversity was carried throughout numerous activities and trainings to make the situation of gender violence in the country visible and eradicated. Not only violence against women, but also against the entire LGBTIQ+ community. As for the Argentine Guys Association, it has been fighting for the rights of girls and young women for many years through various programs. This year, thanks to alliance between the World Association, Avon Foundation, and Argentine Guys, we are working on an advocacy project to end gender violence. From this emerged to where we transform that pursues the same objective, and we are currently actively working on the 16 Days of Activism. Both the Argentine Guys and all the feminist organizations in the country demand that we be able to live a life free of violence, the elimination of all kinds of inequality, and that our lives are no longer in danger just because we are women. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Flo. So my next question is to Sia. Obviously, when we come into this whole issue of victim blaming, this is also interlinked with this whole concept of rape culture. So how is victim blaming and rape culture in the Philippines addressed, and what has sort of Philippines done in terms of handling this situation?
Thank you, Destiny. So first, what is rape culture? Now, rape culture is an environment where sexual violence is normalized, where sexual actions or sexual harassment is tolerated. Now, how does it affect or influence rape culture in the Philippines? Since victim blaming is also almost everywhere, like everywhere as in physical interactions and social media, others think that it is right. They think that it really is the victim's fault that she got raped or harassed. And they turn to be blaming the victims too and tolerate the same actions. When one blames a victim, of course, he or she condones the act of the perpetrator. And I want to put an emphasis on the statement, boys will be boys or men will always be men. That it somehow implies that the urge is natural and uncontrollable. So we girls and women have to adjust to it. But no, that's not how it's supposed to be. So my question is, if boys will be boys and so do men, why can't we also be girls and women without having to suffer from violence? What is so wrong with being a girl or a woman? Now, our perpetrators feel like what they did is fine for the reason that the clothes of the victims are to blame, or because the victims were drunk, and for other reasons that point to the victim to be at fault, and because others support them too. Victim blaming silences the victims. They find it hard to speak out because they're told to be silent. They get blamed for what had happened. They are not heard. And most of the time, people don't believe in them. Some even put a joke about it. And as a result, of course, cases are underreported. And others think that it's not that serious since there are only a few reports about it. And in the Philippines, we have rising number cases of rape, but we know that that's not it. We know that there's a bigger number behind that. And it's because of victim blaming, that the victims are silenced and so they don't want to report anymore, or they are afraid of reporting. Violence against women and girls is a silent pandemic. It's been happening for ages and in the most unimaginable places and situations that we can think of. Just because the numbers are not overwhelming doesn't mean it's not happening. In the Philippines, we have laws, of course, and some perpetrators are punished. But however, we know that behind those numbers, there are still perpetrators who are out there waiting for that chance to take advantage of girls and women. And something needs to change. In conclusion, victim blaming normalizes sexual violence. It silences the victims and enables the perpetrators to go on about their wrongdoings. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Sia. Up next is we're going to talk about the current situation in Sri Lanka, and I will be answering that. So, yes, just like every other country, we also endured a lockdown since March to up until June in Sri Lanka for our first wave of COVID-19. And when we spoke to our national hospital directors in Sri Lanka, something that we found was that the rate of motor accidents happening across the country almost hit zero because of the lockdown that was in place. However, the accident and emergency ward, especially in our national hospitals, continued to remain extremely busy. And when we inquired, what we figured was that there was an alarmingly high rate of women being admitted into the accident and emergency units in Sri Lankan hospitals because of domestic violence. Now, the main reason for this was purely because COVID-19 lockdowns induced women to have no freedom, to basically be stuck at home with their perpetrator. So in terms of statistics, I think the numbers that were reported from the statistics that we have was that of the 8,225 cases that were reported in January, only 241 were actually given medical attention or even legal advice. So this is quite startling in terms of statistics here in Sri Lanka. And another thing is that because of COVID-19, because you cannot step out of your house or because you cannot seek for medical attention, a lot of these women were stuck badly injured, wounded, not only physically, but also mentally and emotionally at their houses with no way to basically seek for help. For this was alarming. And we also found out that this is not only happening in Sri Lanka, this was happening across the world. The entire world saw a huge surge in the number of domestic violence cases. So that was something that we found out, and something that nobody should be proud about, no country should be proud about. But at the same time, the Sri Lankan authorities, especially the Sri Lankan police and our non-governmental organizations, were on standby assisting with a lot of cases and counseling over the phone and online. So that was some form of help for these young ladies. But in terms of the situation, it was such. However, when we ended our first lockdown and we gradually started to get used to the new normal in Sri Lanka, the cases did see a minor drop. However, we are also going through a second wave as we speak. And again, the cases seem to be sort of picking up and being on an upward trajectory. So that is the latest in Sri Lanka. And obviously the reasons for this is that a lot of the perpetrators most often are your partners, your husband, or somebody that you are living with. So when they lost their jobs due to COVID-19 and they lost access to alcohol or their means of income, that anger, that painted up anger and aggression, they took it out on the women they saw at their house or who they were living with. So in a nutshell, that's what it has been in Sri Lanka and across the globe as well. I will not take more time because I'm saving up some time for my next question. Before that, I would like to ask Aliza, how was the victim blaming situation in Malaysia? And if you could maybe even tie it up to rape culture or harassment and domestic violence in Malaysia, Aliza.
Thanks, Dasnani. Okay, so in Malaysia, statistically, 5 rapes are happening in Malaysia daily. And of that, 80% are of toddlers and babies. And of those 80%, more than 90% are conducted. The perpetrators are usually close family members or friends. And this is an alarming statistics. So in Malaysia, I'm going to share 2 particular situations that has happened very recently, especially with the COVID-19 situation. And the first one is that a lecturer in Malaysia, he came out with a statement in early 2020, this year, whereby he disputed a thorough study finding by a women's organization in Malaysia, which is the Women's Center for Change, about causes of rape. So this particular lecturer, he actually blames the victims for the reason of being blamed, for the reason of being raped, due to the fact of their clothing and their behavior. And this was the myth that I shared about earlier. And he even revealed a statistic stating that 2 out of 10 rapes are real rapes. So the question is, what is the definition of real rapes? So real rapes is just an idea used as a convenient myth, meaning those who are not raped because of their clothing or behavior. And this is a situation, a very sad situation that's happening in Malaysia. And people don't realize that why would women actually come through this without realizing of the implication of gender-based violence? I mean, when the person is assaulted or harassed, there's lifelong trauma that they need to face. So why do they need to fake their rape or fake their assault? Because they could possibly looking at unwanted pregnancy. They could even be looking at threats of their life or even professional cost and reputation and livelihood. So this is the stigma that's happening in Malaysia. And another example, a very sad example given here is that recently as well, a politician in Malaysia, he actually stated that there needs to be a law to protect men from being seduced into committing sexual offense. I repeat that. Men need to be protected from being seduced, because what is stated here is that due to what women wear, men are seduced because men have desires like women don't, and men cannot control their desires, and they are provoked to rape. Henceforth, that law needs to be sanctioned. And also, if you look at misogynistic perspective of policymakers and lawmakers and remarks made by men and sadly by some women in the parliament and assemblies, they have toxic views of women and their circumstances. So this definitely discourages victims in Malaysia, and I believe in all over the world, to come forward, because like in my case of the second example, they are demanding a law to punish victims to come forward, which is actually very sad to see, because we are supposed to be protecting the victims instead of punishing them for coming forward. And this is called the myth. It's all based on the myth that it's the victim's choice of clothing. It's because the victim was wearing revealing clothes. It's because the victim did not say no. And it's because it happens with strangers. And they say that women lie about rape. And they even state that men cannot be raped. Unfortunately, in Malaysia, there's also been situation where general people, girls, young boys, they receive rape threats. For example, a case revealed early this year whereby a young girl received a rape threat simply because she resembles a Korean celebrity, despite being covered from head to toe. How is that even possible? I mean, what triggered the desire or the urge to rape? I have no clue there. And looking at how boys have been molested and how boys have been raped, and child pornography has happened in Malaysia, but the child has been blamed for it. Why? And that is my question as well. And all this not only makes rape more rampant in Malaysia, but it supports the rape myth. And they say that it's the fault of the victim. And here, as I said, it includes girls, boys, men, women. At some point, we are all victims. And this definitely discourages victims from coming forward. And since 1980, bills to address rape, sexual harassment, domestic violence, objectification of women in media, incest, and many more have been put forward. Efforts still continue, but they have not been addressed adequately, and definitely there's more work to be done in Malaysia. Though we are moving forward, but a lot of work have been done, needs to be done in the future. So, and as Dasuni was sharing how the situation is in Sri Lanka, the curve has gone up for sexual violence, for domestic violence during the COVID situation, during the pandemic, basically because the perpetrators are usually people of close contact, could be person in your house, close friends, and that's the same case in Malaysia. So thank you, Dasuni.
Thank you for that, Eliza. Also, connecting Eliza's question with the role that media has to play when it comes to portraying women, especially those who have experienced violence, abuse, and harassment. Flo, what can you really say about how important is the media's role in sort of telling these stories in the most ethical and sensitized way possible?
Well, We live in a patriarchal society where symbolic violence rings 24 hours a day, where each case of gender violence, harassment, rape, homicide, or other is trapped by the victim blaming. The most exposed examples can be seen in the media, where the crimes and the guilt of the harasser, rapist, or murderer are constantly set aside, highlighting the clothing, attitudes, or detail of the victim's personal life as motive or provocation to carry out the violent act. I'm going to share with you some newspaper headlines that were modified by girl guides during the Forum for Olden Grabs that we carry out with Together We Transform the past December 1st during the 16 Days of Activism. In this activity, we invited the guys to recognize the different waves of victim blaming, reflect on them, and call to action, but modifying the headlines. Wait a minute. Okay. The first headline says, Horror in Chascomús, Nabila Garay, a difficult childhood, fall of deprivations. The girl worked in family homes, moved away from her mother's house, and lived with her grandmothers. It was modified by Horror in Chascomús, Néstor Garay abused and murdered Nabila Garay. The femicide abused the victim, and when he felt threatened by a possible complaint from Nabila, he killed her. The second says, she went to a clandestine party and ended up dead. She was 14 years old and disappeared. Ludmila Preti had gone to a party with friends. Her last message was that she was returning home in a taxi. Hours later, she was found dead. It was modified by, they keep killing us. Ludmila Preti was murdered. The last one, commotion, wait a minute. The last one, commotion in Luján for alleged gang rape of a young woman. The young woman is 17 years old and was found wandering covered in blood in a park. The first examination found that she was sexually abused and has serious injuries. The victim hasn't yet declared, and there are no identified suspects. It was modified by gang rape of a teenager in Luján. There are no identified suspects. Wait. In all cases, the victims are exposed. Details of their personal life are given using them as justification or motives, minimizing or doubting the real events. Likewise, no information is given about the perpetrators, and in most cases, their image is taken care of and not that of the victims. Although there are protocols to avoid victimization, so the victim doesn't realize the act of violence, avoiding the blame and providing support throughout the process. These aren't always complied with. Let's remember how important the existence of this protocol are, since it's about women who, after a complex process of recognition of the situation of violence in which they live, have decided to ask for help and protection from the justice system. They think they deserve the violence for something they have done. They are held responsible, at least in part. Likewise, we justify the aggressor and exempt him from responsibility and guilt. Even when justice is served, sometimes the sentences are very short or no warrant jail time. It's necessary that we work on victim blaming because the girls Young women and women who suffer it do so for a long time, not only because of the aggression, but also because the indifference, guilt, and silencing to which they feel socially subjected. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Flo. If I might also add into this, as a news personality and journalist myself, a thing that we see is, and the thing that we understand is something like victim blaming is not self-taught. It's something that you sort of understand the more you read or the more you see things, and the more you sort of train your mind to see it. So I think media has a massive role in how we sort of showcase these stories, especially when it comes to stories of abuse and violence and even rape. So more often than not, when we sort of try to relate a story, we find ourselves in that bias ourselves, even though we are trained to understand that this is not right. So at the end of the day, the role of the media is to tell you a story, and a story that you want to listen. So sometimes, in order to entice you, certain details will be put out, like she was wearing a short skirt, she was outside a nightclub, she was drunk, she was intoxicated, she was with so many men all alone by herself. So these little details, although it adds up to a very illustrious story, it doesn't really help the victim nor the situation of victim blaming. So that is something that I feel like media as a whole, not only in my country, but media across the world, something that we should work on. And another thing is that we should not only look at this when it comes to stories only that concerns domestic violence, abuse, and rape, because there is absolutely no point in us keeping all of these sensitivities in mind and portraying an excellent story on domestic violence or abuse when our next story, which has nothing to do with domestic violence or abuse, will just objectify a woman. It doesn't even have to be a story. It can be something as simple as an advertisement. So we sort of feel like both the public and the media must learn to unlearn that system that is in our heads of, oh, if she got raped, where was she, what was she wearing, what was she doing, because none of that actually at the end of the day matters. The fact of the matter is someone was a victim of abuse, violence, or rape, and the fact that she was wearing something, or she was out late in the night, or she was unaccompanied or by herself has nothing to do with it. So I feel like it takes a lot in terms of everybody to sort of watch out for those little errors or little things that aren't actually how a story should be portrayed. So I think that is something that we here in Sri Lanka, especially my organization, is working on, is how to report stories of abuse, violence, and harassment in a very neutral manner, and at the same time to not blame the victim for what she was wearing, who she was with, and at what time of the night. So my sort of little request for everyone who is tuning in is that the next time you read an article, be it online, on social media, on TV, sort of watch out for these little biases. And if you do have the opportunity to reach out to your local media news channel or internet, whatever, I think you have the right to sort of raise this out with them. And that's the only way you can start a conversation and change this attitude. Because that's a trend that we have seen here in Sri Lanka as of recent with a lot of social media users. So the moment you start a conversation on these kind of issues, it can be as something as a little sentence that says, she was wearing a short skirt before she was harassed. And you have the opportunity to question, what has her outfit got to do with the fact that she got harassed? So start small, and it certainly will make an impact in your country and in your region. So my basis is that media has a massive role to play, and we all are in it together because media puts out information to the public, and the public is receptive to that. So the moment you guys raise questions towards the media, that's when I think everyone can sort of sit down and have a discussion on how these sort of stories need to be put out. All right, well, that's my input for now. The next question is to Sophie. What kind of support can girls who experienced victim blaming expect, and what kind of support do they really need, Sophie?
Thanks, Destiny. So I think there is support out there. I think the most important thing for victims to keep in mind is that you're not alone, and you have every you deserve to seek support and have every right to be able to access support. I think talking to people and vocalizing it and not suffering in silence is a big thing. Talking to people who are going to listen without judgment and who are going to support you and not exacerbate the victim blaming are really good people to choose, especially if you feel like you're questioning yourself. And I would encourage you, even if you are experiencing victim blaming, you have questions like, oh, I don't really want to talk to someone because they could judge me more because of such a reason, or maybe I'll just be better leaving it. Actually, I would encourage you to still talk to people about it and still seek support, because often the overthinking that goes on in our heads as we are blamed is completely different to someone who is coming at who you're talking to and is offering you advice from an outside perspective. And counselors, psychologists, teachers are often specially trained in unpacking these traumatic situations in a really sensitive way and non-intrusive way. And they have often a great way of getting you to see that it's not your fault. So I would really encourage you to seek support from people who you trust and who are going to offer you good advice. There are also charities out there for those who are tuning in from the UK. Victim Support is an independent charity for people affected by crime and traumatic events in England and Wales. And their support is free. And I also know that there are a lot of other helplines and support services out there. If you kind of research, and don't be afraid to go out of your comfort zone and research in that way. And also support can be available if you're reporting the issues firsthand to law enforcement or the police. They can offer you direct advice as well. So please don't suffer in silence.
Thank you for that, Sophie. Also, Eliza, if you want to add into this as well, what kind of support do you think young women and girls can expect?
Thank you. Well, it's very much similar to what Sophie said. First and foremost, don't blame yourself. Don't beat yourself up for it. Most of the time, we would want to blame ourselves because we usually have the tendency of I should have done this, I should have done that, I should not have done this. No, I should not have gone for the party. But, it happened. So don't beat yourself up for it. You are not at blame at all. And it takes a lot of courage to come out and to reach out to people. So the easiest and the closest person is someone that you really trust, someone who's closest to you, who would not judge you. Sometimes you just have to speak it out. And we all have different ways of coping with trauma, coping with troubles that we have. Some are introverts, some are extroverts. So it depends on who you are and how can you deal with it. So if at all you need professional help, then go for it. If you're in a school system, you have a school counselor. If you're a working adult, you can easily get counseling. Even over the phone, you have helplines to help. So reach out to people. Don't keep it to yourself. And always remember, it is not your fault. And simple example, like in Malaysia, we have women-based organizations that give counseling for free, both for men and women, because PTSD is no joke. Post-traumatic syndrome disorder is no joke. It's a long-term effect and it could trigger many things in your life. So seek help the moment you realize that you're going through the situation. And if you feel like you can't go to an organization, there are various hotlines, helplines in Malaysia. We have Befrienders, we have Kase. So it is 24 hours hotline. You can just call them up and talk, just talk. Get it out of your system. That's the main thing that you need to do. And also we have an organization by the ministry called LPPKN that offers counseling. So go for it. So don't keep it to yourself. First and foremost, get yourself composed. Don't beat yourself up. Reach out to someone who can help you, because always remember, if you keep it to yourself, you are the one who's going to suffer throughout your life. So don't put that on yourself, because you are better than that. So thank you, Destiny.
Thank you for that wonderful message, Elisa. Also, Yvette, what sort of action is being taken in Rwanda for those who sort of have experienced violence and abuse and even victim blaming?
Yes. So thank you very much. Actually, Rwanda has taken different actions to make sure that to respond to this issue of victim blaming. So it has done this in terms of setting up actions to support all the GBV victims. Instead of being blamed, they are instead being supported. Now that the crime has happened, how are you going to address instead of blaming them? So there are different programs. I want to mention one which is very now common. It's called Isange program. So it's a Isange One Stop Center program. Actually, in July 2009, Rwanda has established Isange One Stop Centers. Isange is a Kinyarwanda word, which means you are welcomed. So these Isange One Stop Centers, they're in different parts in the communities, but every district just have an Isange One Stop Center, where there are people who are trained in terms of responding to GBV cases. I mean, when you experience GBV, gender-based violence, either physical, emotional, economic, or sexual, you go there and you are welcomed by trained personnel in terms of healthcare and psychotherapists are also there, and there are even nurses. So these people, they just help you to recover from the GBV that you experienced. You're supposed to go there without hiding any signs. So when you experience it, you just go straight there without changing anything. And then they process everything without requesting any payment. So what they do, for example, if you are sexually abused, after like finding the perpetrator together with one investigation bureau, you're given pills to prevent pregnancies or even HIV/AIDS, which also are the impact of the sexual-based violence. And you also get psychotherapy for your emotional well-being, because we believe that in case of gender-based violence, you can be affected physically, yes, or sexually, yes, but also mentally. So there's trained personnel who are helping through the process to help you discover from whatever you did. And for this in a remote area where probably they can't go straight, we have trained people in the communities. They are called Inshuti z'umuryango, which is a Kinyarwanda word to mean the friends of families. So friends of families, they're trained personnel on gender-based violence, which help process different cases of gender-based violence in the communities. And what I can just add, there is a free toll to call when you experience gender-based violence. So there is 112. 112 is for Isange Stop Center. So whenever you meet the gender-based violence, you're supposed to call, and then they come pick you. Or you can even call 119, which is for Rwanda Investigation Bureau, who also help to progress with the perpetrator. There are specific laws for people who committed this gender-based violence, which also are helping flattening the curve. So these are the best way that Isange One Stop Center since 2009 has been implementing, and has got success stories, because now the gender-based violence have been a bit curbed. So what I can also add is the different other programs to motivate young people. to also join this tribe of fighting gender-based violence instead of caring. Yes, caring is very good, but you also have to invest into the prevention. Here, I want to give the example of my association, Rwanda Girl Association de Guide de Rwanda, or AGER, where girl guides in my country are striving to also end gender-based violence through this program. So this is actually a program which runs into safe spaces, where girls between 12 and 18 have their mentors between 18 and 25, and I'm also a mentor in the program, where within a safe space, you have 20 girls to mentor within that age. So you're mentoring them about how they're going to prevent themselves. They must know their rights. They must know that even these centers exist for them to proclaim this within their communities, but also make sure that they stand towards ending gender-based violence as responsible citizens. So this is a quite good program which has also broadened the impact in the country, but which was specifically implemented by Association de Guide de Rwanda. So there are also the other opportunities given to young people to take the step. I can give an example of the Accelerator programs where they are releasing calls of application, and the young people are coming with awesome projects to end this gender-based violence through sexual and reproductive health education. And this round is now for people living with disabilities. Like some 2 days ago, we celebrated the International Day of People Living with Disabilities. So within this tribe of preventing victim blaming and making sure that we support these people, we need to make sure that even these people with disabilities are mentored. And the last one that I want to give is the program of TVET trainings to victims of gender-based violence. They are put into different sewing projects which can help them raise any amount of money, and then they are able to sustain their families without depending to the other people who can even bring them into gender-based violence again. So thank you very much. That was the scenario of my country, Rwanda.
Thank you, Yvette, for that holistic sort of view in what's happening in Rwanda. Also, Sia, what can people do to help those who have been affected by victim blaming?
Thank you, Edesini. And I would also like to thank Eliza and Sophie for sharing the support that the girls can get, and with Yvette for sharing the measures taken in their countries. Now, at this point, it is really fair to wonder what we can do to help victim blaming, to end victim blaming. So first is we must listen, we must educate others, we must change our mindset and speak out. First, we must listen. We must acknowledge that speaking out is not easy. It takes a lot of courage. When victims share their experiences, just listen. You don't have to say something at once. You don't have to ask a question at once. And to listen is to believe and understand them. Again, as mentioned by Sophie and Eliza, it is not their fault. It is not their fault. They are not making up stories. And in the Philippines have been recorded to be the country with the lowest age of consent. However, just this year, the Senate approved the bill of raising the age of sexual consent from 12 years old to 16 years old. And this one is a manifestation that we are being heard. Next, we have to educate ourselves and others. This serves as a good point for us to learn and reflect. Just because others are doing it doesn't mean we have to go with it. I believe that something that attracts people is something that we must doubt. We must know why their opinions are like this. What is it all about? What's in it that causes people to act or say these things? We must not jump in and immediately say, oh yeah, it's her fault for wearing such a dress, just because others did. We must read, listen, and enlighten ourselves with what really is happening. We must also educate others, and we can start with our friends and family. We must also not hide this topic from the younger generation. We must teach them that victim blaming is wrong, that all forms of violence are wrong. Now we have to change our mindset. If our current mindset is really blaming the victim, then we have to change it. It's not what the victim wears or the time that she goes out that should be changed, but the mindset. Rape exists because of rapists. And our question should not be what was she wearing or why did she go out so late, but instead, why did he rape her? And one of my favorite lines is from the series La Casa de Papel, or Money Heist, and I would like to share it with you. The line goes, La Resistencia, or in English, the resistance. And we must always remember that we are the resistance. We must resist and not submit nor adjust to sexual violence. And to resist is to speak out. Speaking out is not just against victim blaming, but against all forms of sexual violence. Call out those perpetrators. Sexual jokes are not funny. We must not joke around with sexual violence. Speak against it. Hold the perpetrators accountable. And just because it does not affect you doesn't mean you have to stay silent about it. And over the pandemic, various organizations and groups have been formed, and even individuals have shown support in the fight on violence against women and girls. Now, I would like to end this with the famous saying of Malala Yousafzai: when the world is silent, even one voice becomes powerful. Now, girls and young women need a voice, and we can be that voice. Thank you. Over to you, Destiny.
Thank you, Sia, for the lovely quote at the end as well. Sophie, how do we mobilize people to support victims and to engage not only the women, but also the boys and the men into this conversation?
Yeah, definitely. That's so important. I'm building on a lot of what Sierra has already talked about. Firstly, listening to victims without judgment. We need to be advocate allies and supporters of women. Somewhere along the line, along the process of listening to victims, we have come to treat assault and gender-based violence as no longer a crime. And actually, it is a crime. And I read that only 2% of crimes reported to US law enforcement were false. And so given that only 2% of these crimes are false, it should be our default that we are believing victims rather than questioning themselves or questioning their sanity. We then also need to encourage people to report incidents, not forcefully, but I think that we need to mobilize people through talking about it, through looking at good news stories in the press, and sharing those stories that have been successful and women have been afforded the victory that they deserved. And also, we mobilize people by calling it out, providing education around it and saying, not contributing to those conversations that victimize women, but instead calling them out and saying, oh, I don't agree with that. Have you considered this viewpoint instead? In terms of gaining more male allies, I think that we need to have a response in which we're not just looking at females, that we're looking at how males can also not contribute to victim blaming. I think that starts with education and skill, and that's something that we really need to be mindful of and pushing for as an organisation. But overall, we have a lot to do in terms of mobilisation, but I think after our discussion today, we have well, I hope that we have a bright future ahead in mobilising victims. So thank you.
Thank you, Sophie. We have almost reached the end of today's discussion. And before that, we would all like to take a pledge to stand against gender-based violence and harassment, which is why each one of us will take a unique pledge in line with 16 Days of Activism. So to start off, Sophie, would you like to take the pledge?
Thank you, Destiny. So this is my pledge. So I, Sophie Nelson, pledge not to blame women and girls for violence done to them or harassment that they experience.
Thank you. Well, I would also like to take the pledge. I, Dasuni Father, pledge to speak out against rape myths and gender stereotypes. Flo, you're up next. You can take your pledge.
Here, I'm Florencia Diaz. Pledge to break the culture of silencing women and girls who have experienced violence and harassment.
Thank you. Sia, the time is yours to take the pledge.
I am Seer Lovey, and I take the pledge to speak out against toxic masculinity that harms me too.
Thank you. Yvette, you can take the pledge now.
Thank you very much. I, Yvette Nkurunziza, pledge not to blame women and girls for violence done to them or harassment they experience.
Thank you, Yvette. And Eliza?
Yes. Oops. Since I have a background, you can't see my pledge much.
Right.
I, Aliza Alexander, pledge to stop violence and speak out against harmful stereotypes.
Thank you, Eliza. Well, just like us, you can also take this pledge. You can log on to the WAGGGS website, which is www.waggs.org. The website, once again, is www.waggs.org. When you log on to the website, there is a special banner just in line for 16 days of activism. And you also can join in on this conversation to take action and keep the conversation going. So that's it for our conversation this evening, afternoon, or morning from wherever the world you are joining in. Well, it was absolutely wonderful to moderate this session and to understand the effects of gender-based violence and victim blaming from across the world and the levels of help that these countries are looking at the moment as well. So we sincerely hope that you learned something and you got something and you're taking away something from this discussion. For the Sri Lankan Girl Guides Association, I'm Dasani Atalta, your moderator for the day. Have a pleasant morning, evening, or even afternoon, and reminding you to be safe and be responsible during challenging times.